Good afternoon. My name is Tom Woodward, and I'm the executive director of the C.S. Lewis Society based at Trinity College in Florida. And I want to welcome everyone this afternoon, or if you're tuning in from the West Coast or somewhere between Tampa and that point, you may be deserving the greetings. Good morning. We're so excited to have with us Dr. John Lennox. He is professor of mathematics emeritus at the University of Oxford, and he is fellow in the philosophy of science and mathematics at Green Templeton College. Welcome to Dr. John Lennox. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with anything to do with C.S. Lewis.
Well, and I hope I'm not revealing anything here kind of confidential, but you actually were able to attend lectures by C.S. Lewis. Were you not able to do that as an undergraduate at Cambridge University?
That's correct. 1962, the last lectures that Lewis ever gave to the English language faculty, and it was a marvelous experience, of course.
I can imagine how amazing that was. Well, let me just do some housekeeping at first. I want to just mention that the interview format that we're using will continue for about 30 or 35 minutes. And then we will then be switching to take the called in or the submitted through the internet questions. Some of them will be voted up, and we will be trying to take those that have received the most votes. If you have a question for Dr. Lennox, very briefly, this is how you can do it. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then you will type in your question. You also have the ability to upvote a question by clicking on the thumbs up, and that's the way that gets upvoted, that icon under the question. And we'll be focusing on those questions that received the most upvotes. And please note that we have some other questions that have been submitted in advance. Thank you to all those who have done that. We have close to 300 joining us from across the United States and overseas. And we're going to be closing the chat now. So some of you have been accessing that. So I want to just mention that we'll be recording the webinar, and it will be made available. The link at our facebook.com/CS Lewis Society will also be made available. And of course, our website, apologetics.org, is where you can learn about all the other webinars, including Dr. Steve Meyer, holding up a little facsimile of the book that will be published literally in about 2 weeks, The Return of the God Hypothesis, a long anticipated blockbuster book. He will be giving a seminar on that. And of course, Dr. Michael Behe talking about his work, and two other outstanding scientists and scholars, Hilary Morgan Ferrer, How to Destroy a Culture. She is the leader of Mama Bear Apologetics, and of course, Dr. Jonathan Wells in Zombie Science. So you can register for those by going to our website, apologetics.org. So let's jump right in. Dr. Lennox, if I could just ask real quickly, you have, in your experience, been able to lecture across the world on this very topic: has science buried God? And I think your book, God's Undertaker, is the most powerful single book ever attacking this issue. Tell us, what are some of your experiences in prominently atheist countries? Have they often heard the other side, how science actually can be fitted together beautifully in kind of a perfect match with the Christian faith?
Well, in my earlier part of my life, I spent quite a bit of time behind the Iron Curtain, and particularly in East Germany, and then later after the wall fell in Russia. And in countries like that, they were just staggered that someone like me could even exist. And I've been told in several academies of science in Russia that I don't exist. You cannot be an academic, you can't be an intellectual and believe in God. So there was certainly that kind of experience. But I've met that in the West, of course, as well, through people that feel that there's an essential war going on between science and religion, and science won it long ago. And I have dedicated quite a lot of time in my life to combating that idea and pointing out that science actually and God go together very well. One of the main reasons for that is a simple matter of history. that the pioneers of modern science like Newton and Kepler and Galileo and Clerk Maxwell and Faraday were all believers in God. And to quote C.S. Lewis, and we might as well do that to start with to get him into this, C.S. Lewis said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And I'm not at all ashamed or embarrassed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity gave me my subject.
Amazing. That is a powerful, kind of personal journey that you've experienced in encountering the forces of scientific atheism, trying to blend science and atheism together as a package. And we see that there's powerful historical examples of believers who have cut, as it were, opened the swath, had opened the way for science. Let me just ask a question, and this would be, I think, along the lines of what you've already said in your book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? If you were asked to provide 2 lines of evidence from the universe itself, that's one of your topics or your focus points of study, 2 lines of evidence for the existence of God, just from the big picture of the universe or the Earth system, the Earth itself and its parameters, what would you say would be the 2 of the most compelling lines of evidence that can be shown and pointed out today?
Well, you could never restrict an Irishman to 2. I'll give you 3. The first of them is that science can be done at all. Before we get into the details of science, people often forget this, that scientists start, all of them, all of us, start by assuming that the universe is rationally intelligible. Now, it was Einstein that pointed out that he couldn't imagine a scientist without that faith. It wasn't faith in God. It was faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And to my mind, the only way we can explain why science could be done, that the universe is at least in part accessible to the human mind, is because there is a God. I can point out later why I think atheism cannot cope with that question. But coming specifically to it, I think 2 of the things are the fact that there has evidence from science and the standard model of the universe that there was a beginning. The Bible has said that for thousands of years, and it was only in the 1960s that science caught up with it, that we discovered that there's a beginning to space-time, and secondly, that science itself has revealed in the last 100 years or so the remarkable fine-tuning of the fundamental constants of nature that point towards a fine tuner. I remember talking with a very famous atheist who invited me in Oxford here, invited me to give a seminar to his students. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism. Well, I said, if you tell me what it is, I'll use it. And he said, well, if I were ever to be persuaded of Christianity, one of the reasons would be the powerful fine-tuning argument. And I think it is powerful. That is evidenced by the fact that so many leading scientists, like the late Stephen Hawking and so on, desperately tried to explain the fine-tuning without a creator. And I think they failed, signally failed to do so.
Well, let me just bring Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The God Delusion. And I should note that you are practically the only apologist that he has actually engaged in debate. I think 3 or 4 debates at last count. And so I want to just point out the importance of those available on the internet through YouTube and other platforms. But Richard Dawkins has famously said, well, ultimately, God is the great complexity behind this complexity. So how do you account for that complexity? Who basically is responsible or as the causative factor behind God? Therefore, the Christian argument collapse. How do you answer Dr. Dawkins?
Well, the first thing is that's a very silly question. And I am just amazed to hear that from an intelligent person, because just let's analyze it. If you want a bit of logic at this time of day, and logic is extremely important in this this area. That question amounts to saying, if you believe in a creator, then you have to ask who created the creator and so on. Well, if you ask who created God or what is responsible for it, in your words, what is responsible for God, then you're talking about a created God. And of course, created gods are fictions of the imagination. We usually call them idols. And it doesn't take Dawkins to tell us that created gods are a delusion. But you see, what that does is completely beg the question, because the biblical claim is that God was not created. He is eternal. So Dawkins' comment, though it seems very clever, doesn't deal with the existence of an eternal God as claimed in the Bible. And really what we're saying is this. Philosophically, looking at that, it's saying, do the questions stop or do they go on forever? In other words, do we say, God created the universe, who created the creator, who created the creator, that created the creator, and so on, back infinitely often? Or do the questions stop? Now, they do stop on both sides. I find that people like Dawkins, the questions stop with the multiverse, the universe, or in these days, the most popular cause of everything is nothing. On the Christian side, the ultimate cause is God himself. Now, the sting in the tail of all of this is that, as I put it to Dawkins in one of our debates, so far as I recall, I said, look, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your own question. Who created your creator? And I've waited for many years and never got an answer to it. So it really is a foolish question, because it appears to put a barrier in the way of the existence of God. It does no such thing. It simply puts a barrier in the way of believing in idols, which we don't believe in anyway.
Thank you for taking Dawkins on again and summarizing your powerful, thrusts in that debate. Actually, those debates, I should make it plural. So let's move into the realm of genetics and the world of living things, which is you as a mathematician have a special appreciation for the vast quantities of digital information encoded in DNA. So what would you say? And I just love your book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? And then Gunning for God, your reply to the New Atheists. Those are two mandatory reading books for all people interested in apologetics. I just think they're fabulous. But what would you say to those who say natural selection can take care of anything we see in biology? After all, natural selection is a rule of life. And of course, Christians do believe in natural selection in a certain way. Can you clarify the evidence you see in DNA or the living world that is powerful supplementary evidence beyond the physics?
I'm not a biologist, but I'm very interested in biology. And what is very clear to me and many other mathematicians, that natural selection does account for something. It accounts for minor variations, for example, that Darwin noticed in finches, their beak lengths in the Galapagos Islands. But it is not creative. It doesn't go to any extent in accounting for the nature of the complexity of genetic material in DNA. But what I'm pleased about is in the last number of years that biologists have begun to see this to such an extent that there's what is now called the third way in biology, leading biologists who are basing their work on that of a Nobel Prize winner, Barbara McClintock. And one of my colleagues at Oxford, Dennis Noble, who's a fellow of the Royal Society and really regarded now as the father of systems biology, in an interview, he stated very clearly that neo-Darwinism doesn't need to be improved, it needs to be replaced. So actually, the fact that natural selection is very limited in what it can do is now becoming much more mainstream in biology. I think the important thing here is to realize that what we are claiming is actually intuitively obvious to anyone. The moment we see language, we see the word exit, E-X-I-T, above a door. It's only 4 letters. But if we ask ourselves, what is the origin of that sign above the door? Well, it may have been made in a factory by a robotic machine tool, etc. But all of us know that the existence of EXIT, which we understand as meaning the way out, the fact that it has meaning, it has a semiotic dimension, indicates that there must be a mind involved in this somewhere. And I am just staggered that people can look at the human genome with its 3.4 billion chemical letters in exactly the right order, like a computer program, but very much more sophisticated in many ways, and say that this was caused by chance and necessity. I not only do I not believe it, I see no reason to believe it. I think that what is happening here is the fact that we can do science and describe the universe mathematically, which is a language. Mathematics is the most highly compressed language. The fact that we can describe one of the core things in human biology or in genetics by linguistic and computer-like concepts points towards the best explanation of the universe, which is this: in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through the Word, who is God. I see that as a brilliantly perceptive and correct explanation of the world as it is. This is a word-based universe.
That's really significant because of the additional work that has been done revealing codes that are sitting on top of the codes, the epigenetic codes. And as I was trying to point out in my book, The Mysterious Epigenome, What Lies Beyond DNA, there is a tremendous explosion of additional layers of code upon the code, which I think you would agree is a major turning point.
I do agree. And in fact, you mentioned my book, God's Undertaker. I have totally rewritten it. It's now 50% longer and will appear in July under a new title, Cosmic Chemistry, Do Science and God Mix? And there's a great deal of this kind of stuff in it.
Well, let's turn to the moment that I've been waiting for, your experience of producing Against the Tide with actor Kevin Sorbo. That must have been quite a thrill. And I mean, you deal with not just the science, but the empirical, historical evidence as well. That must have been just an eye-opener and a great review. What would you point out as some of the verification that we have solid evidence of not only that there was a Jesus, historically speaking, but that he was seen alive after his crucifixion?
Well, one of the motivations for making the film, and it wasn't my idea, that was an idea of a very brilliant American physicist, Steve Huff of the Pensmore Foundation, was to do 2 things. It was to discuss questions of God and science in the Oxford setting. But then it was to go further than that, because many people approach both you and me, Tom, and they say, okay, it's all very well to say there's evidence for God in science, but you're a Christian. Well, I mean, how does that fit? Do you need extra evidence for Christianity? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. And so we filmed the second half of Against the Tide in Israel on location, dealing with the life of Jesus and specifically in Jerusalem with his death and all importantly with his resurrection, to get across the idea that we haven't followed cunningly devised myths, that this is a matter of history and based on history, a matter of human experience. And it was a marvelous thing to do. Kevin is a very amiable questioner, and it was quite fun. Although I must say that the film genre I find quite difficult, because when you're filming, you don't always do it in the logical order of the final film. And you have to remember that you've already been in Galilee or you've done that in Jerusalem and so on. But this film should be available within a week or so now on DVD and Blu-ray.
Well, I think the C.S. Lewis Society will do a special feature on that on our upcoming program of The Universe Next Door, which is heard across the U.S. and is available by podcast on our own platform. My story of coming from atheism to Christianity as a freshman at Princeton University is actually being shared this weekend. And so I'm excited to say that I myself thought there was nothing to Christianity based on my scientific commitments. And then I realized really good science is good knowledge. And speaking of knowledge, scientists are grappling everywhere with this thing called consciousness. And to define it just in materialistic terms of matter or neurons is failing spectacularly. Would you just give a quick kind of capsule kind of reaction to that? Isn't this area of consciousness trending, or it's always been, but isn't it trending powerfully as a pointer to a source above us, a rational being who is the ultimate source of consciousness?
Yeah, I agree with that. Consciousness intrigues me because, as you probably know, I've just written a book on artificial intelligence called 2084, AI and the Future of Humanity. And the great barrier that people tend to ignore in the notion that we can create a superintelligence is the question of consciousness. And the plain fact is, no one knows what consciousness is. It's not that we can explain it, but not in materialistic terms. We can't explain it in any terms. We have no idea what a thought is. I remember speaking to a youngish Nobel Prize winner, and I asked him what his dream ticket was. He said, I'd just love to know how the brain can hold a thought for 30 seconds. He said, we have absolutely no idea. And I think this is enormously important because, again, thinking about it, we are conscious beings. If we imagine that our origin, the cause of our existence, was less than conscious, we fly against every analogy we know. And it's another way in which I think the universe in here points beyond itself. Mathematics and science points beyond. Genetics points beyond. Consciousness points beyond. And so if we follow the lead of our perception, intuition, and logic, I think yes. And it's going to prove a huge barrier to people that are trying to reconstruct a human being from scratch.
Wow. The idea of science's inability to get its arms around consciousness. I mean, yeah, you love to tell, I think, a story, and if you don't mind sharing that if your imaginary Aunt Matilda, I don't know if you actually have an Aunt Matilda, but I would be great to imagine that. But I think that is such a captivating, relevant, powerful statement on how science has its area, but not every area can be tackled by science. So mention the dilemma about the Aunt Matilda cake.
It's a hugely important thing that science is limited. I'm speaking of the natural sciences, is limited. And we can see that relatively easily. Einstein once made the point that you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. In other words, there are questions that the natural sciences cannot address. And my little story, which I got from a friend and a mentor who has sadly passed away at the age of 94 or something, is about Aunt Matilda, my mythical Aunt Matilda. She bakes a cake, and there it's sitting in front of, let's say, 50 Nobel Prize winners, and we ask them to analyze the cake. So the chemist will reduce it to chemicals, and the physicist will talk about the various atoms and quarks and elementary particles, and the biologists, etc., etc. And let's imagine they've all done their massive reports on this cake from a scientific perspective. And then we say, well, thank you very much. This is extremely comprehensive. There's just one question left, ladies and gentlemen. Please tell us why she made the cake. And there's dead silence, of course, because they cannot, through their scientific analysis, tell us why she made the cake. And she's sitting there grinning widely because she knows why she makes the cake. Now, here's the point. The only way we get to know why is if she reveals it to us. Now, many people suggest to me that Christianity is irrational. It's not irrational because it believes in revelation. And we can think of revelation without going to the supernatural. And it clears up a whole host of ideas. We will understand why she makes the cake if she reveals it to us, reveals it in her words. Now, when we hear what she has to say, we don't close our minds down because this is revelation. We use our rationality to see if what she says makes sense. If she says, I made it for the man on the moon, we're not likely to accept that. If she said, I made it for my nephew John, well, then that makes perfect sense. So what we're saying here is science can tell us a great deal about the how. It can also tell us about the why of function. Why is this bit here and why does it do that? It cannot deal with teleology, the why of purpose. And it's no insult to science to say that. I found one of the most helpful people on this was Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize and worked in Oxford. And he said it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot even answer the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of life? And he pointed out you've got to turn to literature and theology and so on to answer those questions. So we're insulting science if we suggest it can answer every question. And the sad thing to my mind is that many leading people, thought influencers like Dawkins, have espoused what we call scientism. Science is the only way to truth. And that just isn't so. If it was, your alma mater of Princeton would have to close down half its faculties tomorrow because it's got literature there, it's got economics, it's got philosophy. Those aren't natural sciences, but they're rational. And that's the point I want to make, that going beyond the natural sciences does not mean we're going beyond rationality. And that is hugely important because many people think it does, that if it's not science, it's not rational. Sheer nonsense.
Wow. I am pumped up and ready to bring in the first of our voted on questions. So this is really exciting as we get into questions submitted by our very engaged audience. And I want to just throw this out because I know that you're aware of, and I believe you contributed to a massive, significant volume called Theistic Evolution, a comprehensive critique, used philosophy, empirical, anyway. So it was a collaborative work of people on both sides of the Atlantic. But some people are saying, could we not just say that evolution explains the science and God explains the why? And so what do you see as maybe one of the reasons that, and without getting into the details, what evidence do you see that the marriage of God and Darwin is not a good match?
Well, first of all, I didn't contribute to that book. There's some very good stuff in it.
Mhm.
Well, of course, we could say that evolution explains the science and God explains everything else, but that just isn't true. It's not factually true, not even from a scientific perspective. As I was saying earlier, and people need to read what's going on in biology because it's very different from what was going on a few days ago. The star of Darwin is descending very rapidly, and we need much more. That is much more explanatory power to deal with what you referred to, the epigenetic phenomena, the layers of language-like complexity, even on top of DNA, although evolution doesn't explain DNA anyway. It doesn't. And of course, the thing that's often left out of these discussions is evolution has nothing to say about the origin of life itself. Because whatever evolution does or doesn't do, it depends on life being there in the first place. So you cannot use something that is a consequence of life if it exists at all, to explain life. And we're left there with a huge mystery that grows and grows. The more we know about the nature of life, the less we've got to explain it in naturalistic terms. But bringing God into the equation makes perfect sense. And God is not there a God of the gaps. It's that the only explanation that makes sense of something that exhibits a language-like structure is mind. So it's not a mind of the gaps any more than my little illustration of the word exit. If somebody says, I think a mind was involved because that exit has a semiotic dimension. If I said to them, nonsense, that's a mind of the gaps, well, most people would think I was absolutely silly. So you can say that evolution does this and God does that, but dividing the magisteria like that, I think, is a fundamental mistake. That was Stephen Jay Gould's idea. And if you look at it, that won't work, because what actually it means, if you read the small print, is that science deals with reality and God deals with everything else, like Santa Claus and tooth fairies. But you see, let's get back to the absolute basic fundamental statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's talking about the very same heavens and earth that cosmologists study. So there's an overlap between the two magisteria. I will, of course, agree, and it's perfectly right, that theology and the Bible deal much more with the teleological questions, but they do have something to say about the nature and origin of our universe and of humanity. And what it has to say is of huge importance. People might well ask, how did they get it right? And God said, this is a word-based universe. In the beginning was the word. How did they know that centuries ago?
Brilliant answer. I want to just say that many people are upvoting here a question. The next question is, with so many pieces of the evolutionary explanatory system falling, as it were, down and dropping off in their persuasive power, considering these pieces of evidence, why do the scientists keep pushing so strongly? And you still read it to this day. This is a fact. Do not question it. We have it all explained. Why? How can they do that in the face of such hostile findings?
I don't understand that. If you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have said the situation is an anomaly in the philosophy of science. What do I mean by that? Well, usually a worldview, you don't deduce a science from it. For example, you cannot deduce Newton's laws or Einstein's equations from a worldview, whether it's Christian, pantheistic, or atheistic. You can't. But the atheistic worldview is connected with evolution in a completely unique way, by which I mean that if you read, as I hope people do, Lucretius, and see what he managed to get in his day, the Latin poet Lucretius, he wrote a book called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the physical universe. And what is fascinating about that book is he got all the evolutionary ideas that Darwin had, apart from the transmutation of species, and he deduced them from pure philosophic materialism without any evidence at all. Now, here's the problem. If you are committed a priori, that is, your presupposition is atheistic, it's materialistic, then you've got to believe in evolution of some kind. And that is demonstrated by Lucretius. So it's very difficult if you come at it with that kind of prejudice. And one of the most famous people is Richard Lewontin, who was a geneticist. He's a brilliant guy, but he was very honest in telling us, look, the methods of science don't force us to materialistic conclusions. we are forced to accept them because we believe in materialism to start with. And then he let it slip what was really behind it all by saying, we must not let a divine foot into the door. But that isn't science. That is a prior commitment. And the difficulty is hitting your question directly. I think there's a lot of fear that people who have spent their whole lives committed to atheism and thinking that what science is applied atheism or applied naturalism or applied materialism. To think that they might have been wrong opens up such a black hole in front of them that they just are terrified to go there. And therefore, they are not prepared to apply the normal canons of scientific honesty to the whole thing. But some people are calling them out. One of the people that's calling them out at the moment very effectively is the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel in New York.
Yeah, so if I can just comment on that, I mean, I've written a review, it's posted on apologetics.org, and Nagel maintains his atheism and tries to almost redefine the view of reality as having God's stuff sprinkled, or at least mind stuff sprinkled everywhere alongside the protons and neutrons and the quarks. But his attack on Darwin is almost beyond belief in its power, isn't it, Nagel's?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, his argument, which actually isn't new to him, C.S. Lewis got that argument years ago. And C.S. Lewis made the point, if my theory doesn't validate thinking, then my theory cannot be true because I reach it by thinking. And I said earlier on that atheism cannot cope with the effectiveness of things like mathematics and so on. And I often test my friends and colleagues and so on. I say, what do you do science with? And they say, my mind, except many of them deny the existence of the mind. They say, my brain. And I say, okay, give me a brief history of the brain. Okay, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And then I smile at them and I say, and you trust it? Be honest with me. Now, I've tested many people with this question. If you knew that your computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I've had the answer from many brilliant people, and it's always been, no, I would not. And I say, I see you have a problem.
That's brilliant. I love it. So we have an upvoted question. We're on a roll here. This is just too much fun. What is your take on human origins and historical Adam and Eve? And I know that some of the people at Discovery Institute have done massive and very exciting work in this area. Could you update us on that? Is there a case for an actual Adam and Eve?
Oh, I think very much so. But for the details from anthropology, you better read what you just referred to. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that the central issue is that of the supernatural dimension, because physicists and cosmologists are happy to accept a singularity at the beginning of space-time. Now, I want to argue that there are several other singularities, not many. In Genesis, at the beginning, we read, and God said, only 5 or 6 times. And therefore, it seems to me that working backwards, at the heart of my Christian faith is a singularity. What is it? That God became human, that Jesus rose from the dead. Those are 2 singularities. That is, they do not fit into a naturalistic framework, but they are intelligible and rational if there is a personal God who's behind them. Now going back, a singularity at creation of the universe, a singularity at the origin of life. Science certainly points towards that, because we're no further forward in understanding the origin of life on materialistic arguments than we were in 1953. In fact, we're further back. But then there's the question of the origin of human beings. It seems to me utterly clear from the scripture, and I'll start there because it's very important for me as a reference point, that human beings are made in the image of God. That is not said of any other part of the natural world. We are a special creation made in the image of God. Now, how do you tell that from fossil bones? I haven't the slightest idea. But why would one believe that? Well, it seems to me that there are two claims that are central to the biblical big story. The first of them is that God made human beings in his own image. What does that actually mean? Well, the second big claim is that God became human. Now, let me put this very carefully because it is stunning in its implications. Human beings, 101, are enormously special. Why? Because God himself was able to become one. That is staggering to my mind. And why would I believe that? Well, I would start with my faith that Jesus is God become human. And if that is true, then the idea that human beings were started by God doing something, a singularity. Now, what that consisted in is a matter for debate and interpretation of Scripture. As I read Scripture, it seems to me that this is God getting directly involved and creating human beings. Now, there is space for disagreement on these things, but the crucial issue is this a supernatural thing, or is it simply a consequence of the mindless, undirected unfolding of a mechanism that doesn't even have the power to do much more than operate the lengths of finch beaks?
Wow. So powerful answer and another set of powerful questions. I know that we are needing to wrap up here in about 5 or 6 minutes. So let me just one person, actually a group of people have upvoted the question from this person. Does the multiverse theory, and if you could just touch on this lightly one more time, does the multiverse theory with its ever increasing endorsements by leading physicists negate the notions of a teleological argument for God's existence? Just touch on that, just briefly.
Well, I don't necessarily think so. I'm not sure that the endorsements are increasing because Stephen Hawking, in his last paper, which is published posthumously, seemed to rock back from the multiverse theory. And of course, it doesn't impinge on God in the slightest. One of Hawking's co-workers, actually, who wrote 7 or 8 papers with him, is a man called Don Page, a Canadian physicist. Don is a Christian. He accepts the multiverse theory. And I wrote to him about what he felt. And he said, of course, even if the theory's true, it doesn't impinge on God at all. And obviously not. Philosophically, God can create as many universes as he likes. And actually, according to a book that I know and love very well, and so do you, there's an indicator that this universe is not the only one there is. So the multiverse idea, of course, is highly speculative. Now, I'm biased. I was taught quantum mechanics by the late, just recently died, Sir John Polkinghorne. And he pointed out that these universes are not accessible to us. We can't prove their existence. And he felt it was much more economical and therefore scientific to believe in a single universe created by an intelligent creator than a multitude, infinitely many, whatever that means, of universes to which we haven't any access and for which we cannot provide any evidence that they exist apart from certain speculative ideas in quantum mechanics. So no, the multiverse doesn't argue against God. And incidentally, in that connection, those watching might be interested to know that my book, God and Stephen Hawking, has been upgraded and will reappear in a second edition in July now that he has died. And I've got quite a bit more about the multiverse in that book.
Very good. So let me combine these last couple of questions. Some Christians are listening to the attacks that are found against intelligent design at BioLogos. I know that some of the more extreme of those critiques or criticisms Dennis Venom, et cetera, are maybe being pulled off. But what would you recommend as kind of, if you want to get the other side, is evolutionnews.org, what would be a way to access the big picture, so you can hear not just attacks on intelligent design from Christians at BioLogos, but maybe hear the other side? And then I have one more very quick one.
Well, I think people like you and I and Steve and so on have tried to do that. And I always say to people, look, if you want to start with Tom or with me, with the books we've written, look at them and then look at the footnotes and see what we've read. That's the way I recommend to all people, to find their own books. That's one of the most exciting things in life. If you've enjoyed a book, then look at the footnotes. What has this person read? And then go and read those books as well. And very soon you'll have a library bigger than the universe.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I know that at evolutionnews.org, one of the most important websites that you and I consult on a daily basis, they have some of the most powerful responses to BioLogos. Let me just ask this. It's a delightful question. I think you'll enjoy using this as our closing question. Then we can maybe refer to some bibliography and then bid you adieu. What significance would you say there is in apologetics for the change in one's heart? That is the fruit of the Spirit, as a person commits that person's life to Christ and to his lordship. Is that a significant part of the big apologetics picture?
Yes, and I'm very glad you asked the question, because what is apologetics? I don't like the word, as you probably know, because it sounds like an apology, and it is a Greek word, apologia. It means defense. And the best translation of the concept, I think, is persuasive evangelism. We're trying to persuade people of the truth of the Christian message. And we're using, at least in part, rational argument to do so. But also, part of that rational argument is reasoning about experience. And that is very important. Let me put it this way to you, Tom. I get a question like this frequently. You're a Christian, you're a scientist. How could you possibly believe the stuff you believe? Because in science, things are testable. And I mean, Christianity is not testable. And I say, who told you that? I wouldn't be a Christian if it wasn't testable. And they say, how could you test Christianity? I said, very easily, and you can do it. But it's going to put you up against some big issues. Like what? Well, I say, look, Christ made certain claims, and they're very big claims. He claimed to be the truth, not merely to say the truth, but to be the truth. He claimed to be God come down as your Savior and mine, because we need to be saved. We actually have fallen short, not only of our own standards, but even more so of God's standards. And he offers us forgiveness, peace with God, and all of that. And what he claims is this, that if you and I are prepared to trust him and repent of the mess that we've made of our own lives, and we've all got mess, and possibly, sadly, even the mess we've made of other people's lives, and trust him as Lord, who bore the weight of all that yuck and sin on the cross instead of us, then he will immediately give us forgiveness, a sense of peace with God. He'll give us a new power to live, and he'll give us a transformed life. You can test that. And I have. And I tell them a story about Harvard, and it illustrates this beautifully. I gave a lecture in Harvard some years ago, absolutely packed, several thousand, and I finished. And a Chinese student stood up on the balcony and shouted, "Look at me." And of course we did. And I called back because he was looking at me. I said, "Why are you asking us to look?" He said, "Look at me." His face was shining. He said, "6 months ago, I was at Penn State University and I heard you lecture." And he said, "Something you said triggered something in me. And I went and I started a search." Now, I can't remember the details of it, but basically he found Christ. He became a Christian. And he said, I was in a terrible mess in my life. I saw no way out. It was absolutely hopeless. I was in despair. Look at me now. And you know, it was one of the most powerful messages. It was far more powerful than anything I had said. And when you've seen that not once, but dozens of times, as I have done, then you put two and two together and you get four. That this stuff is transformational. It's not simply answering the big questions about the universe, though it's doing that. It's not simply making rational sense, although it's doing that. What it is doing is bringing you into personal contact with the living God. And it's so important, especially as we come to the end of this session, Tom, to realize God is not a set of propositions. God is a person. And he, in his goodness and grace, and it's absolutely wonderful, one of the things he's done is made you and me in his own image. The universe and the stars are beautiful. They're not made in God's image. You are, which means, amongst many other things, that you are capable of having a real relationship with God. But the trouble is we've messed up, and therefore we need to be, to put it frankly, we need to be forgiven. We need to be saved. And that is possible through Christ uniquely. And so we come to that experiential side. And the only way to experience it is to experience it. Yeah. You know, if I tell you that there's a red Maserati sitting round the corner and you can drive it away and keep it, we can sit and talk for hours about whether that's true or not. But unless you get up out and go and look, you'll never know. And it's exactly the same with Christ. Unless you get up and engage, you will never know.
Wow. Well, I think with that, we will conclude our amazing interview with Dr. John Lennox, Oxford University, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics, Fellow at Templeton Green College in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science. I want to mention that just while you're with us, John, I was reading with some other gentlemen here in Tampa Bay the closing chapters, the last part of the book of Mere Christianity, book 4. And in that place where he's describing the Father, Son, and Spirit, he says only the Christian revelation has this idea of a relationship that is infinitely powerful and pulsating and energetic. And then he says, if you want to think of it, you can think of it as a dance. And I think what you're saying is Christ is inviting us to come to the dance, something like that.
I think that's right. That idea of an intimate relationship that's meaningful. And, you know, I've enjoyed my science, I've enjoyed philosophy and all this stuff, but it pales into insignificance when it comes to the fact that here I am sitting at the age of 77, and death lies before me, but it's a doorway into something vastly bigger. And the Bible whispers to me about the ages of the ages. It's utterly exciting what God has prepared for those who love him, as he says. And that's why I'm very enthusiastic about the kind of work you do, because if only we could see beyond what is beyond, then it would change us utterly. And coming to engage with Christ is what will open that door, not into Narnia, but in the real world beyond.
Amen. Well, if you're listening today to this wonderful interview, I would just like to say, if you could just help us out by taking a couple of minutes to complete a brief survey that will be available after the meeting concludes. Just look at your screen there. You should be able to take part in that. If you would, that would be so wonderful. Also, you can register for other webinars in our series coming up with Steve Meyer, his powerful new book being released in just about 10 days. He's going to be giving us a very special overview of the entire book. And we're going to be doing a review of the work of Michael Behe. And I'm teaching a course based on his book and another one, Darwin's Black Box, the bestseller, voted one of the top books of the millennium. And then I'm also doing in our study here at Trinity College on Darwin and design, working with this outstanding book, Darwin's House of Cards by the late Thomas Bethel, who just passed away. So it's been a real thrill. Thank you, Dr. John Lennox, for being with us and giving us part of your afternoon there in Oxford.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you for listening to our first of the Cutting Edge Apologetics webinars. See you there for the Thursday evening, March 25th webinar. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.